Now, we are, of course, working our way towards Christmas. The children are still at school, but there's no guarantee that the children are all at school today. Some of them may be with you listening to the programme at present. The next segment probably isn't suitable for more tender ears, and you can make your own decision in relation to maybe occupying the children elsewhere. Having said that, it is a massively important conversation. I want to first of all speak to Amanda Ferguson. Amanda, good morning.
Good morning, Frank.
Amanda, we were reminded yesterday just how many monsters exist in this part of the country when it comes to the sexual abuse and general abuse of children. And the latest name to be across the headlines was David John Andrews, who pleaded guilty to 130 charges of sexual abuse, some of them just beyond description. It is incredible, and as a result of this, of course, there are so many survivors and so many victims. Maybe you could put it in context for us, just what we heard yesterday.
Yes, I can, Frank. As you rightly said at the start of this conversation, it's a conversation that can make some people feel very uncomfortable, but it's an important one to be had. And there was that high-profile case last month of Alexander McCartney, the global catfishing case, a young man from Derry pretending to be a teenage girl and a very depraved individual using the internet to target children. And then yesterday, 55-year-old David John Andrews, who originally is from the Shankill, was told he must serve at least 13 and a half years after he pleaded guilty to 130 charges, and he had been pretending to be a teenage boy. So, you know, Frankie, you could go down to the courts any day of the week and there will be abuse-related cases on the court listings. But it should be remembered that children are at risk from strangers, but they are also at risk from the people in their homes, and on occasions from people they know, often people who their family trust. So, you know, we know of Amanda Brown from her book, No Peace Until He Is Dead, and Amanda's book about abuse by her late stepfather, Davy Tweed. Many listeners will know of as a politician and a sportsman, but we're not focusing on him today. We're focusing on the Brave movement and the Victims and Survivor campaign. So Amanda Brown told me about the Brave movement, a really excellent global survivor-led campaign that centres victims and survivors as those people who are experts by experience, sadly, are perhaps best equipped in many ways to tackle the scourge of abuse, that they want to be centred in that. So Amanda had told me about her work with fellow victims and survivors, Haileigh, Ashton, Lamont, and also Michelle Duffy, and I think we're going to hear from Amanda and Michelle in a little while. So we put together a piece for the Sunday Life at the weekend, who do an excellent job covering all of these court cases, but also giving space to these features for survivors to talk about their experience. So whenever I was talking to Amanda and to Haileigh and Michelle, they spoke about the stigma that's associated with talking about child abuse, you know, and we know that 1 in 4 children are likely to experience that. It struck me when they spoke about getting to the point where we are with the mental health campaign, as in people have reached the point where they feel comfortable to talk about mental health, and they really want people to get to the point where abuse isn't sort of talked about in awkward and hushed tones, because that only protects perpetrators. The focus for them in the interview that I did, which will be online if people want to read it, is the need to centre victims and survivors in policy making, of improving justice system outcomes, of improving access to counselling and trauma support, and having a trauma-informed response to all of these areas. And another thing that they mentioned was about making sure to try and stop the silo working that maybe happens at Stormont, that may happen among the sector that's tasked with dealing with these issues. And I know the women have had good experiences with the Justice Minister, Naomi Long. She's been great and told them she's committed to doing her best for them. So they're due to have another meeting with her, and also with the Health Minister, Mike Nesbitt, just really about how anyone who's interested in ending the scourge of abuse can work together to try and make that a reality.
It must be almost impossible to live with. The story of the catfish abuser from Newry that we covered a few weeks ago, this one yesterday, it just makes your spine chill. But as you've said, they're not all high profile. They're not all indeed in the headlines on a daily basis, but they are going through the courts almost on a daily basis. You mentioned Amanda, and very kindly Amanda's agreed to speak with us. Amanda, good morning.
Morning.
Amanda, you were very brave in the aftermath of the abuse that you suffered at the hands of someone who we saw in the past as a rugby hero, someone who people voted for in the DUP and indeed in the TUV eventually, Davy Tweed. But as Amanda has quite rightly said, it's not about the abuser, it's about the abused. And this is what you're putting the spotlight, this is what this Survivors Council is putting the spotlight on. How important is the formation of this council that you'd be aiming for to help you come to terms with what you went through, Amanda?
Well, I personally have done a lot of work over the years to come to terms with what has happened to me, but it's important that we have a council put together that is filled with survivors to be able to feed into and shape the policies, the systems, the processes, the services and the education around childhood sexual abuse, and that is to help prevent what we experienced as children, and also to help lead people through what is a very difficult justice system. The services as well that we have currently, from what I'm hearing from other victims, is that it's not fit for purpose. We need more input from survivors to be able to shape what we need in order to help us through this entire process and to prevent it happening in the first place.
It is devastating to think that it is so common. And to be honest, as I went through my life, I presumed that it was a very rare thing, child abuse, I wouldn't know anyone who was abused, or I wouldn't even have ever been made aware of anyone who was abused. And then, of course, I went through a school process whereby after I'd left school, I discovered that the head teacher of my school was a paedophile. And I then realised how many people had been affected by his presence on earth. I liaise with Deirdre Maguire from deirdremaguire.com, who appears on this programme regularly, and the number of people that she has worked with who were abused as children. It seems to be so common in this country that people are abused as children, and it's something that we've got to be much more aware of it, don't we, than I would have been going through my life.
Well, yes, whenever we're children, like as you say, going through your life, and it still happens now, that we're taught stranger danger as children. We're told to be aware of the strange man that lives in the end of the street with his dogs. Paedophiles aren't strange men living in houses on their own. Paedophiles live in our homes, they're in our churches, they're in our schools, they're in our sports associations. They are everywhere. And this is what people need to be aware of. We need to educate people and change society's thoughts on what a paedophile looks like. I find it incredibly frustrating myself as someone who has experienced what I have experienced to still hear people making the assumption that this still doesn't happen and it doesn't, it isn't as prevalent as what it is.
That's what we want to think, isn't it? Those of us who've never experienced it, we want to think that life and the world and Northern Ireland is a better place than it actually is. Sadly, there must be so many people listening to this programme who have been abused as children, who maybe never have the courage to speak about it, never have the courage to take steps against the perpetrator. What would you say to those people as someone who knows about it, Amanda? Because there's no point in me talking about it. I don't know about it. But as someone who's been there and gone through it, what would you say to people who are almost suffering listening to this conversation?
I wouldn't say that they are not courageous for not speaking up. They are courageous for showing up every day in life considering what they have experienced and what they have been through. The courage and bravery isn't about speaking up. For me, it's about wanting to pave the way and help other people, and to break down the stigma and the barriers, and to help break down the shame that we as victims carry. So I wouldn't consider myself any more brave than anybody else who hasn't spoken out. Anybody should be able to seek out help without making it public or without going through the police process. And part of what we want to do in terms of setting up this Survivors Council is to be able to create spaces and services that are available for those people who are not able to speak out for whatever reason.
And how could someone who is suffering come forward and talk to you or talk to council members? How would that work?
Well, people can find me online, Facebook or online, and if they want to reach out to me, they can. I am not a trained counsellor, so I would not be able to counsel them, but they can speak with a counsellor, a professional counsellor. Now, it doesn't always work for everybody, and that's okay. But there are various methods of speaking out and healing within yourself, whether that is sitting down, going through talking therapy, or whether it's through other therapies. Like you can manage safe touch and get over that issue with the likes of massage and things like that. And there are various talking therapies. There's different support groups out there as well that are available, and I don't want to name any specific ones, but the information is out there. If people want to look for it, they can go online and find various support groups, especially social media. There'll be various support groups out there.
Okay, we'll give a helpline at the end of the conversation. Amanda, I really appreciate your time this morning, and indeed Michelle is also with us, Michelle Duffy. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, Frank.
Michelle, what you went through, and again, we're not spending a lot of time looking back on the perpetrators, but emphasising what can be done to help you and indeed other people who have suffered. But I always find it difficult to say what you've been put through from your age 4 to 16 by 4 different men, none of whom ever faced trial. How did you brace yourself to be the successful person you are now as a social worker and indeed as a children's counsellor, Michelle?
I think just sheer determination of, enough of my life had been taken by these individuals, and I didn't want any more of my life to be taken. But that being said, for me, life was very difficult right up until I was in my late 20s, because there was no support available. There was no counselling, and fortunately I had enough money to pay for therapy myself, but many other people don't have access to be able to pay for therapy. So for me, therapy has been a lifeline.
You've just returned from an international conference in Colombia. There's a global effort to help people who have indeed been abused, children who've been abused, people who've been living with abuse. Do you feel at all that governments, while they may have, they'll have representatives who of course attended, but is there a real willingness within, I suppose, the structures of society to correct this cancer that exists?
I think coming back from Colombia, so there was 117 countries representative over in Colombia, which is huge. And for me, it really highlighted that actually this is a huge issue all over the world, and every country is facing the same problems. And I don't think it's that countries don't see the problem or don't want to make changes, because there are things being put out there, like there is in Northern Ireland with the 2 strategies that have recently been released. But the problem is everywhere that these policies and services are very fragmented and disjointed. There is very little survivor voices in the implementation of these. So a lot of the time, they fail to hit the mark. And this is why we are really campaigning for this Survivor Council. Because...
How do you know it's okay? Because, but I'm interested in how it's going to be structured. Do you feel that it will come to fruition?
Well, we've got the support of the Justice Minister and the Health Minister at present. I think it has to be implemented. In Germany, there is a Survivor Council, which is the gold standard, which was implemented in 2015, and we're recommending that Northern Ireland follows that same process. And they have been leading the way, and actually they've been instrumental in services, created to support survivors.
Well, all I can say, Michelle, is, and again from the position of simply being a radio presenter, I'm listening the way that other people are listening, some of whom will have no experience whatsoever, thankfully, of any form of abuse. Others will be listening who have been abused and have taken the steps to ensure that the abuser maybe was arrested or sentenced, while there'll be people who just haven't had the opportunity, the courage, the knowledge to take any steps, the ability, because of the devastating lives that they have had. And I would say, as someone who just represent all of the listeners, that I think a debt of gratitude is due to the likes of yourself and Amanda and other people who are survivors who would want to set up that council. It can only do good, and I do hope it comes to fruition for you.
Absolutely. And, survivors, we are the experts. We know the gaps in services. We know what needs to change. And in Northern Ireland at the minute, and yes, whilst lots of organisations and the people who work in those organisations have a lot of skills and knowledge, survivors can advise in ways that others can't.
It's a very, very good point. Your voice must be listened to. Michelle, thank you. Amanda, thank you as well. Also Amanda Ferguson, thank you indeed. You'll understand now why I suggested that maybe if you have the children at home at the moment, it'll be a difficult conversation. But it's a real conversation. This is the real world. 02890 333 105 is our number. Again, thanks to Michelle Duffy, to Amanda Brown and Amanda Ferguson.